G'day legends, happy Monday. I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic start to the week. Now legends, as always, of course we have a lot to go over. Of course we have to talk about the horrific strike that took place in Sumy yesterday, leading to a mass casualty event with many civilians and children caught up in that. But we need to talk about this a little bit further because it is not as clear as a lot of the media and politicians would like to show you. Now, it is absolutely horrible, an atrocity when civilians get caught up in this. But upon a little bit of digging and then officials coming out with statements as well about the military parade that may have been taking place at the same time. And I've done a little bit of further digging in this, but then we need to talk about civilian casualties, military targets, and when can you target something knowing there's going to be civcas? Where is the actual line at what that then crosses over to targetable or untargetable? So we'll talk about that a little bit. Of course, we'll look at the maps, we'll compare maps. I want to talk about then the reality of a ceasefire right now versus the leaders pushing for this. And we're going to focus on Starmer and Macron and what they are saying about unconditional ceasefire. On one condition, though, Mr. Starmer and Macron, the condition is that then there are no conditions that Russia can put on it, which is not really where you have the leverage from then the position of Ukraine currently in the position of weakness on the battlefield. And what you're asking Putin to give up, you are asking Putin, being unconditional, to give up all his leverage on the battlefield while maintaining the leverage you have over the Russian economy. And then we need to talk about some sign-up increases as well to fight. But I do want to clarify something in the beginning that I said yesterday. Now, I believe neither you or I were incorrect or correct, but I want to add a little bit of nuance, which I failed to add yesterday. What I stated was that France doesn't have the industrial capacity to head up the coalition of the willing, that really in Europe, it should be Germany doing this. And people correctly pointed out that France has currently a larger military industrial capacity than Germany. Now, this is correct when we talk about aerospatial and naval industry and assets. France, of course, has a large land warfare industrial base too, but to my knowledge, Germany still outpaces France in land armoured then industrial power. But my point isn't aimed just at what is being made now. My point is aimed at Europe being able to mobilize enough money and assets and factories to supply Ukraine and restock themselves as well. And what we know so far is obviously these nations are not meeting that need. This is very obvious because we have countries like Poland and Norway and Finland. They are going towards South Korean weapon systems. The reason I brought up Germany in this wasn't military industry. I was talking about total industry, in which Germany does have a much larger total industry, therefore capacity that could be mobilised to rearm these states. I was talking about total capacity there because at wartime you need to take in the total capacity of that. But I just wanted to clear that up because I was incorrect and somewhat correct at the same time. Now, what I want to talk about first is something that you and I have predicted. What I said is I believe once we get finish line goggles on in this war, we may see a large increase in Russians signing up to join the Russian armed forces for that massive sign-up bonus, of course, of money that has never been available before to the average person in Russia. And we see this, Rob Lee is sharing this today, that the Vertska media reports that recruitment in Moscow increased in March and April. Their sources say that financial motivations remain the driver. And they're wanting to get this before the war ends. That driven by high sign-on bonuses and speculation the war will be over soon, more than 1,000 men join the Russian military every day. Several independent reports from Russia point to this high recruitment rate. This is the data set here of 37 Russian regions in a post then below that Rob Lee is replying to on Twitter. And this was, of course, one of our predictions, that when there's light at the end of the tunnel and that ending is close, we will see huge sign-ups. Like I said, this money in that amount, when you take in purchasing power parity, that has never been available in Russia, and people, young people, do not want to miss out on this, and a lot of old people too. They're seeing this as a way to assure inheritance, even if they die on the battlefield. Now, this may be dire, but at the end of the day, that is the reality. One thing I think that could take place when we get more and more near the end is, could we see motivation for very dangerous operations fall, because you can see the end, that you want to live to the very end and then survive following the war. We did see this with Russia's 40th Army in Afghanistan, a unwillingness to do operations the closer and closer it got to seeing that end. Okay, let's have a quick look at the maps, and then I want to talk about ceasefire and where Europe is just sort of off in the bloody trees somewhere. Anyway, but here we have then the map of Ukraine. Of course, you have the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. And if we switch this on, the red check that you will see in 4 locations today is where Russia has advanced over the past 24 hours. Where will come first is into then Kursk, of course, where Russia has crossed into Sumy, and where Ukraine's once 1,000 kilometers has shrunk down to, from these numbers, about 36. Many would say it is significantly less than that. So let's then have a look at what Suyak is saying here. Situation Kursk front. In the last 2 days, Russian army took control over several positions west and northwest of Guaivo, right in here, so out to the west of here. Now, what we need to do is you line up the tree lines, the paddocks in here. This is easier. So see this paddock in here where it like dicks up in between these, that all of this has come under control out to then where this borderline hump is there. Significant. Thus reaching the outskirts of Gunal. In addition, Russian forces managed to capture the northern part of Lochnia. So this is something which I don't know. This is a very large claim. This is Novenki, Basivkia, and then Lochnia, where, of course, we have seen, and it's been confirmed because you've got grey zone in here. We've had geolocations, but we don't know how far out, that the Russians have crossed back into Ukraine. Now, Suyak is saying, remember, Suyak has been very reliable, but we don't have any evidence of this, that they have made it up to Lochnia in the northern outskirts here. So it's hard to see exactly where, but see where these paddocks come off out to the west just before that. So if this is correct, let's go, it's here to here. You're talking about 3 kilometers behind the line. And remember, this 3 kilometers, that is what we are seeing daily in this grinding war of protracted attrition now, but some then 10 kilometers behind then the border line. So this is an area, really, really keep an eye on this. Remember how important Zelensky and Sursky said this was for leverage, and that has been decreased actually now into the negatives, because Russia hold, according to what I'm looking at across these maps, they hold more in Sumy than Ukraine does in Kursk. Now let's continue moving our way down. Now we're not seeing anything in then the northern part of the country. Come down here around then Terny, Yampalivkia, and you can see this Russian advancement out here. Now remember, I don't believe this is new. Remember, this has been grey for a while. Suyak has showed that all the way down to Zadashne has been red for some time. So just keep an eye on that. But what we can confirm is there's definitely been movement there. Now we'll come down Toretsk. No changes shown on here, but I do have a Suyak map update for you just out to the west here, the northwest of Druzhba. So this is Druzhba in here, that the Russians have made some ground between somewhat Druzhba and Dashny, as well as up this road out of Druzhba as well. So some minor changes there. Toretsk, very difficult to actually know what is going on. Of course, over the past 3 days, we have seen significant change to the east of Pokrovsk, and we see this again today to the north of then Alexandropol towards Sukabalka, that the Russians are making more ground. And this area, this whole Kalinove through to almost New York area, filling in at the moment. Then we have this Suyak maps in here. Now he isn't showing as north as Deep State. So what we do is, realistically, if a Ukrainian map is showing more of a Russian gain than a neutral or Russian map, we are more likely to believe that, and vice versa, but also showing this filling in around Katanove as well. So there's been a lot of effort and resource put into this location at the moment. Now that is the end of our Syriac maps. What we have is towards Kotlini, we have a Russian advancement here. Again, Syriac did say that there was some advancement here in the past few days, and around then the Zaporizhia front line here, this filling in. Again, Syriac did talk about that as well, but otherwise on the maps, no other significant changes. Now before we talk about Sumy, I want to talk about ceasefire realities, and this will link into, of course, what is being said because of that horrible then strike in Sumy. So Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, he has said that Zelensky has shown his commitment to peace. Putin must now agree to a full and immediate ceasefire without conditions. Although the condition is that Putin must not have conditions. So there's at least one condition in this. And what I say secondly to this, and we talk about this a lot, that it may not be moral, ethical, or right, but the losing side in an attritional war has never and will never be calling all of the shots. This is exactly why these states, they want to put Ukraine in a, quote, position of power, also known as winning, so then they can call the shots. Of course, leverage is a spectrum, and Putin doesn't have all of the leverage, and Ukraine hasn't lost all of the leverage, but along that spectrum, Putin has a lot more of it. And what Putin does is he plans to increase his position. And the change in the rhetoric versus the lack of change we see actually on the front, this tells me a lot. That change of rhetoric, that is being the most concerning thing to myself recently, is we have seen that Ukraine then, they didn't want a Christmas truce. Then Ukraine and Europe has said, no, a ceasefire only benefits Russia, all of this. And now this huge shift in we want an unconditional ceasefire, we need this end, blah, blah, blah. That tells me a hell of a lot of how behind the scenes they're actually assessing the situation, that they are assessing that Putin can increase his position of leverage. That's what that is telling me. Now, Macron, of course, the president of France, he has tweeted about these missile strikes as well, but I want to focus on the ceasefire part. Strong measures are needed to impose a ceasefire on Russia. France is working tirelessly towards this goal alongside its partners. But what measures are you actually willing to put in place to, quote, impose this on Russia? Not just talks and holding meetings. And this again returns to my question of, or what? What do these leaders do beyond tweeting and giving Ukraine a limited supply of weapons? What happens if Putin just says no? What then do you do? That's the question that needs to be answered. This is what I've called the forbidden question, but it is the most important one. And we have been given no answers to this. So therefore, I see that Putin will just keep prolonging this because there has been no answers to, if Putin just continues, if you can't impose this, you're not willing to do it, what happens if he just says no to it? What are you actually going to do other than further meetings? And we'll talk about how Putin, we believe, sees this. And this is the thing. The issue that we have is we have heard the same bullshit year on year that has amounted to lots of money and lots of lives being lost. But it hasn't actually put Ukraine in a better position to negotiate than the negotiations that the UK basically tore up in Turkey in early 2022. In fact, it's actually in a much worse and more dire position. And that shift in rhetoric tells me more than any movements on the front line do. And this isn't only on the battlefield, it's also in demographics of people who have emigrated and people who have been lost and wounded. And it's also in Russia's movement toward the global south and China. It is not just us here on channels that see the reality, that see this as empty rhetoric. It is also Putin and his leadership that see this, that if they want to impose this, they need to give Putin a reason to stop. You've got the carrot or the stick. Firstly, either the stick is not big enough, or that the stick that may be big enough is unavailable to Ukraine. There's not a willingness to give those assets. Or that your carrot's use-by date was 2022 and that you need a new carrot because that one is now no longer bloody right to eat in the crisper in the fridge. You're dealing with this as if it was back then, as if the battlefield was in a far different shape. The unconditional ceasefire. This sounds great, but if it was paired with unconditional trade, you'd get a better view of reality. And people saying, well, we can't do that. Both sides here, the West and Ukraine and Russia, they want leverage over each other. Russia's power, their leverage over Ukraine is their military and the actions on the front line. The Western power over Russia is economic. So, in this ceasefire being proposed, you are only asking Putin, who's in the position of the power right now on the battlefield, you are only asking Putin to give up his leverage with nothing in return. You're not willing to move on that economic leverage that you will maintain. Macron and Starmer, they are smart enough to know this. They have no real interest in ending this war. They want Russia weaker regardless of the consequences. What I once thought was propaganda, was speculation, was theory, is becoming more and more truthful because you see that these people are smart enough to see that that is so ridiculous to ask the winning party to forego all of the leverage while not giving up any of your own, that this isn't in the best interest of the people you are saying you are wanting to protect. This quote here, in diplomacy, insisting on unconditional terms from a position of weakness is not negotiation. It is wishful thinking masquerading as strategy. Such an approach guarantees only prolonged conflict and ensures harsher terms in eventual defeat. So we need to talk then from Putin's perspective, which we somewhat have. And we need to summarise it like this too, that understanding an adversary requires seeing the world through their eyes without surrendering your own vision. This is where I think many people fail to recognise where Putin and his team are moving things around. Given the position on the front line of Russia objectively winning the attritional war at the moment, the economy looking like it can stand up to certain challenges, the rhetoric coming from Europe that contradicts the US position of which you're in talks with the US, and the costs that your country, that Russia, has incurred in this war, we need to ask, with what is being put forward on this unconditional ceasefire, why would Putin now come to the table? You're asking him to give up all of his leverage while you maintain your own. And this goes back into those points around where then the power and leverage sit and why this is wishful thinking masquerading as strategy by these guys who I do not believe are just ignorant to the realities. I actually think it is more malign than that, to be honest. Now, let's talk about this strike that has taken place in Sumy. Of course, before we actually get into it, of course, Sumy is then what sits just outside of Kursk. We're seeing a lot of action taking place at the moment. And this is absolutely horrible, what has happened. It's horrific to see this amount of casualties. And this is something that we see far too often. It is command disregard for collateral damage and disregard for protecting civilians. But this goes both ways. It's Russia's command launching missiles into areas where civilian casualties will occur. And Ukrainians' command irresponsibility in placing military targets within these same areas. This was something I expressed concern about while I was in Ukraine in 2022 following an amnesty investigation that I talked on. And I said, I am concerned about what I am seeing and what this investigation has found. Now, the statement that people will say, which is correct, is that none of these people and the several children who died would be dead if it wasn't for a Russian missile. And that is correct. But you can't use this to absolve the command who may have made this area into a target. It's not then taking the blame and shifting it. It's just saying, hey, look, we need some responsibility for that also. Likewise, the Russian command they have signed off on a strike which they knew there would be large civilian casualties. So saying that you put a military parade here or an award ceremony or whatever it was doesn't then absolve the Russian command from that either. So what am I on about this parade or something happening? I thought these missiles just would hit an open area of civilians. Well, that's what it looked like in the beginning from the footage. Then we saw some footage of some military vehicles there too. But then we had the mayor of Konotop, an area in Ukraine, release this somewhat cryptic video just after this happening. And good morning, although it's not a good day to all. I'm addressing the governor of the Sumy region that he has until 1800 to get on his knees and resign, or he's a dead man, and that he'll have a red hat with you. The subject here of does not oppose anything in the head of the SBU of the region, so Ukraine's intelligence service, saying there was speculation about then running away from this area as well. I don't know on that, but he's saying that he needs to resign as well, the scarecrow head of your administration, and there are rockets coming for money. He said it just happened by 6 o'clock, 1800, that you need to either resign or I will tell you what has happened. And in this, he's saying that there's more than 20 dead. And what he's referring to, we sort of found out after this was somewhat cryptic, was there was, according to then Ukrainian officials, such as this gentleman, an MP, that there seems to have been a parade, a military celebration parade here as well. The organised here today, then award ceremony and honorary certificates and medals to our boys and our heroes from the brigade of the 117th. Everybody talks about it anyway. Everyone writes about it. It's no secret. It's not true there was nothing military here. He's saying there was military items here. Now, upon a little bit of further investigation, let's look at the 117th Territorial Defence Brigade. And what we see is that it was formed in Sumy Oblast on the 13th of April, which of course was the day this missile, or these missiles, hit. So it does seem, again, likely when you have officials saying this, and it was the day of then the formation of this unit, it does tend to line up. But it goes further than this. Of course, we have a very controversial Ukrainian MP, Mariana Buzulga, who we've talked about before, the People's Deputy Head of Ukraine, saying this, that Russia shelled the centre of Sumy on Palm Sunday. I'm appealing to Sursky and separately to the commander of the territorial defence, do not gather the military for awards, and especially in civilian cities. Again, the Russians had information about the gathering, saying the SBU had leaked information here as well, that do not give awards and formations in civilian areas. She's saying it's the fourth year of then the full-scale invasion and the more than 20 dead. I believe the count at this point in time is around 34. I could be incorrect on that by the time this goes live. Then we had a 4-meter deputy commander of Ukraine's infamous Azov Brigade saying that Sumy a terrible tragedy, a war crime. The Russian military political leadership, which launched a missile strike on the city centre, the Ukrainian officials who decided to hold a celebration of awards for our soldiers in the same centre for the sake of their public relations. Also gathered civilians with children there. So what he's saying is he's going along the same lines of you can't just absolve everyone of this. And what people are saying is that to these celebrations, to then these awards, that families were invited along as well. So let's talk about civilian casualties. Of course, in the background, you'll see the area very recently most infamous for civilian casualties in Gaza. Sadly, civilian casualties is placed behind military operational importance. That high explosive, long-range weapons have taken some troops out of the battlefield and placed civilians in the battlefield as they can reach further. Some may remember my predictions on the Israeli Defence Force casualties before they went into Gaza, that my predictions were 3 to 5 times higher than it was. That was in line with other military analysts as well. That number that we came to, that was because we were working on calculations of infantry assaults, not massive shelling and bombing before clearances. Now, what the justification of these attacks are from Ukraine to Gaza to Israel to Moscow to Syria has shown me, and the continued justification of this, is that the leadership and the media, they don't really care. They care about the image, the narrative that it shows, and when it is the right civilians, not the wrong ones. And it is horrible that you'll see media, bloggers, whatever, celebrate when it is at the opposing side's civilians, although civilians are inherently neutral. Now, what actually is the laws of armed conflict, the rules of engagement on this? Militaries may legally attack legitimate military targets even if civilian casualties are anticipated. But strict adherence to the points of distinction, proportionality, and precaution is mandatory. The problem is all of this is based off what you see happening, not after what has actually happened. It's not after the fact, and all of it is classified. Any attack expected to cause disproportionate civilian harm relative to military gain is illegal and considered a war crime. But again, this is all before it has occurred and is classified. How is this measured? Who is enforcing it? Again, it is completely subjective. So let's go over some of then the laws here of lawfare as well. And this is an investigation, but you get a lot of good information about this, about the Jabalia camp attack, of course, in northern Gaza. And what we see is that the surgical director of the Indonesian hospital, I'm sure you're familiar with, said that it received 400 casualties, 120 dead, and the majority were women and children. The IDF, they then released a press release stating that IDF fighter jets acting on intelligence from then the Israeli security agency had killed Ibrahim Bari, a commander of Hamas, as well as one of the leaders undertaking the October 7th massacre. In this, they said that underground terror infrastructure embedded beneath the buildings had been destroyed. That's the reason why it became a legitimate military target. If you take this statement at face value, it enables us to dismiss questions over attribution and the possibility of various forms of mistake, misidentification, pilot error, and weapons, that this strike was no incident. It was an attack on a known military target apparently executed as planned. But was it lawful? And this tells us a lot about then the signing off on these strikes too. Proportionate civilian killing in law and practice. It is, as is well known, the killing of civilians is not necessarily unlawful under international humanitarian law, IHL. While the intentional targeting of civilians is always prohibited, civilians may be lawfully killed if the harm is incidental to an attack on a military objective. And as stated in Article 51, Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, the expected, quote, loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof is not excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Neither Israel nor the US is party to Protocol 1, but both accept the rule of proportionality. So if you see that your military advantage is more than the loss of civilian life, it is then legal. But there's a lot of problems in this because the test is prospective. It does not depend on post facto assessment of actual civilian harm, but balancing for foreseeable civilian harm and anticipated military advantage. Now, a commander who knows or suspects that civilian will be present at the site of a planned attack on a military target is obliged to make an estimation of the expected civilian harm. Of course, this is in US and NATO militaries known as the CDE, or collateral damage estimation. Only if the expected damage is proportionate, not excessive, can the attack lawfully be executed. Again, though, things that are classified is the reason we can never actually then get an idea of if this is proportionate or not. In a case like we have seen in Sumy, we go, well, we have 30 plus CIVCAS. What was the target? That will never be released because Russia will keep it and their assessments as classified, and Ukraine, they will never release what was happened there. So again, we don't know. We can't actually assess on this. Same everywhere. Seeking to compare or balance two values are not consumable obviously resembles a problem in moral philosophy rather than an exact science. So there's not objective of it's 1 to 2. The expected civilian harm is less than the direct military advantage anticipated. Perhaps the more immediate problem is communicating proportionality limitations to commanders and their subordinates. The US and allies in wars like Afghanistan and Iraq developed the concept of non-combatant casualty cut-off value, or NCV. This effectively assigns an operational value to the parameter of X, specific attacks or operations, at least as regards for death or serious injury. So in X up here, the suspected civilian harm, basically how many civilians can you kill for military advantages. As with all rules of engagement, from ROEs to these NCVs, the non-combatant casualty cutoff, this is classified, as well as the targeting, as well as all of that. What I said back in the day, if you followed me for a while, is that if Israel want to continue this and get some level of support, or not just the international condemnation they were receiving, was you need to declassify some of these after the fact of how did you actually come up with the then targeting sign-off of striking that. Now, there are differing NCV then values for different operations, and there's a lack of comprehensive comparative data that makes precise figures very elusive. And of course, we even have far less for Russia. But here are some, just to maybe give an idea. Again, the actual ones will be classified, but these are off just reported examples. Now, something we didn't talk about in there is the perceived value of local civilians and the perceived value of the target. Now, this is going to make a lot of people happy, but the value attributed to civilian lives depends on racial and geographic factors. For example, a domestic terror attack will use an NCV close to 0. So if there's a domestic attack, the then amount of civcas that is willing will be close to 0. If you have an attack that may be very similar but done in a different geographical racial area, it may change significantly. Lower NCVs are considered acceptable for high value targets. High NCVs are usually considered unacceptable for civilian infrastructure, humanitarian sites, and densely populated areas where the risk of civcas is greater. So if it's a high value military target, you will say we can justify more civilian casualties, then we need to take down a bridge or humanitarian site. Now remember, these will be classified, but this is what is getting reported in the Iraq War, that high value targets in the initial phase had an NCV of 29 to 30. In Afghanistan, NCV sat at 1, although that would change mission to mission. Israeli forces in Gaza, for a junior operative, would be 15 to 20, seniors up to 100, and 300 in one instance of a particularly senior operative from unnamed military sources. What we don't know is we don't know how the Russians assess their own NCV and sign off on the targeting of areas like this. We know that this attack has killed more than 30. We don't know exactly what the military value actually was. Of course, we will never know. That's why assessing things like this is so difficult and so sensitive, because you have completely innocent people caught up in this. But not everyone should be able to clean their hands and wash their hands away with this. There has been systemic stuff-ups from the targeting to planning of events as well. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.